The bells had just stopped ringing, the vows were halfway spoken, and then the doors of the church flew open, and a duke who had not set foot in that village for 12 years walked straight down the aisle, past the priest, past the groom, until he was standing close enough to touch the bride. He did not say a word of apology. He did not explain himself. He simply looked at her the way a man looks at something he thought he had lost forever, and the entire kingdom would be talking about what happened next by nightfall. This is the story of a wedding that never finished, a promise made 12 years ago beneath an oak tree, and a secret one woman buried so deep she almost believed it herself. Stay until the end, because the reason behind this interruption is not what anyone in that church expected, including her. The bells had only just stopped ringing when the sound of horses tore through the quiet of the village square. Every head in the church turned at once, the vows still hanging unfinished in the air, the priest's hand frozen mid-gesture over the open book. Through the tall doors, thrown open by a force no one inside had invited, came the cold morning light. And behind it, a man no one in that church had expected to see again as long as they lived. He did not remove his hat. He did not offer apology. The Duke of Holloway walked down the narrow aisle of a church built for farmers and tradesmen, his boots loud against stone that had never known footsteps like his, and the entire congregation rose without being asked to, some out of habit, some out of fear, all of them out of the simple human instinct to make way for power when it walks toward you, uninvited. Briallen Marsh stood at the altar in a dress she had sewn herself from fabric she had saved for 2 years to afford, her hand still resting in the hand of a man she had agreed, with great care and greater resignation, to marry. She did not turn around immediately. Something in her shoulders went still first, the particular stillness of someone who has spent 12 years preparing for a moment she hoped would never actually arrive. But before we go any further into what happened inside that church, if you have not yet subscribed, now is the perfect moment to do it. We tell stories like this one every week, stories about silence, about truth that takes too long to arrive, and about the people who wait for it anyway. Hit subscribe, and let's go back to where it all truly began. Briallen had grown up in the kind of poverty that doesn't announce itself loudly, but simply never leaves. The poverty of mended hems, of meals stretched thin, of a mother who counted coins twice before spending them. She had learned early that wanting things was a luxury reserved for people whose fathers had not died, owing money to half the village. And so she had stopped wanting, or had told herself she had, which amounted to nearly the same discipline. What she did have, she had built herself. She sewed for the wealthier families in town, her stitches so fine that even women who looked down on her station sought her out by name. She kept her own small accounts, paid her own small debts, and asked no one for charity, not even when winters were hard enough that asking would have been forgivable. Her pride was not loud. It simply existed, quiet and load-bearing, like a wall no one noticed until they tried to push through it. She had agreed to marry Cassian Worth not for love, though she respected him, but because a tailor with steady work and a gentle temperament was the closest thing to safety she had ever been offered. She had told herself that safety was enough. She had nearly believed it, and she had certainly never told him, or anyone else still living in that village, about the years before she arrived there. Years that belonged to a girl with a different name, in a different life, standing under a different sky. Before we continue, tell me in the comments, have you ever had to choose safety over love the way Briallen did? I want to know if you think she made the right choice, or the only choice she had left. There had been a kind of love once, long before Cassian, long before the village had even learned her name. It had not ended in cruelty or betrayal, which made it harder to speak of, not easier. It had ended the way storms end, not with a single violent break, but with a long, exhausted quiet that left everything changed and nothing resolved. She had walked away from that love because staying would have cost her everything she had left of herself, and she had never regretted the choice, only mourned it, which she understood were two very different things. Cassian offered something that love had never been able to offer her: certainty. He rose at dawn, worked with steady hands, spoke kindly to his mother, and had never once, in 2 years of careful courtship, made Briallen feel as though she were a question he was still deciding how to answer. She had chosen him deliberately, the way a woman chooses a sturdy roof over a beautiful one, understanding that beauty does not keep out the rain. She told herself this was wisdom, and perhaps it was. But wisdom and peace are not always the same thing, and on the morning of her wedding, dressing in the small room behind her mother's kitchen, she had caught her own reflection in the cracked mirror and felt, for one unguarded moment, the specific ache of a woman doing the sensible thing, while some smaller, stubborner part of her still waited for a sky that had gone quiet 12 years before. The village had its own version of Briallen, assembled from fragments and convenient assumptions, and it bore only a passing resemblance to the woman who actually lived among them. They knew she had arrived as a girl with no family connections to speak of, that she kept to herself, that she worked harder than most and complained less than any of them. They decided, collectively and without much discussion, that she was simply an unfortunate young woman making the best of a modest life, and having decided this, they stopped looking any closer. Sours, Edda Linnet, who had taken Briallen in when she first arrived in the village with nothing but a small trunk and an unreadable expression, was the only person who had ever come close to the truth, and even she did not know all of it. She had asked questions in the early months, gently, the way one asks a wounded animal where it hurts, and Briallen had answered just enough to satisfy the asking without ever actually answering. Mrs. Linnet had let the matter rest, telling herself that some doors are kept locked for good reason, and that love sometimes means respecting a lock rather than forcing it. The wedding, in the town's eyes, was a small mercy, a quiet woman finally finding a quiet, decent life. No one in that church that morning, save perhaps Mrs. Linnet in the deepest, most unspoken part of her, suspected that the woman standing at the altar carried inside her a name the entire kingdom would soon be saying aloud. Tristan Holloway had not returned to that particular stretch of countryside since he was a young man of 20, long before his father's death had placed a title on him that felt, even years later, like a coat cut for someone else's shoulders. He had built, in the time since, a reputation for being precise, unsentimental, and almost unreasonably composed in matters that unsettled other men, a reputation that had cost him more than anyone watching from the outside could have guessed. He had returned to that village exactly once in his memory before today, and the visit had ended in a way he had spent 12 years trying not to think about, with limited success. He had told himself, across more winters than he cared to count, that the matter was settled, that time had done what time does, and that whatever had happened beneath a particular oak tree on the edge of that village belonged now to a version of himself young enough to be forgiven for it. He had not planned to return. He had received, 3 days prior, a letter that undid 12 years of careful, deliberate forgetting in the space of a single paragraph, and he had not slept since reading it. By the time his carriage reached the edge of the village, the wedding bells were already ringing, and something in him that had been quiet for over a decade rose up with a force that frightened him more than it should have. For a man so famously composed, you might think this is simply a story about a man returning for the woman he never stopped loving. It is not that simple. What Tristan Holloway carries in his coat pocket on this very morning will explain far more than you expect, and one piece of it has nothing to do with love at all. Keep watching, because the real reason behind his silence for 12 years is about to come into focus. He had read the letter so many times in 3 days that he no longer needed to unfold it to know every line, yet he carried it anyway, pressed flat against his chest in the inner pocket of his coat, as though proximity to the paper might somehow make its contents less true. It was not a love letter. It was something far heavier than that, written in an unfamiliar hand, but signed with a name Tristan recognized at once. Hollis Price, a former clerk who had managed certain private accounts for his family years ago, and whose sudden, unexplained departure from their service Tristan had never fully understood until this letter undid 12 years of careful, deliberate forgetting in the space of 4 short paragraphs. Beside the letter sat a second object, far older, wrapped in a small square of velvet gone soft with age. A ring that had belonged to his grandmother, the one piece of his family's history he had kept hidden from every formal engagement he had ever been pressured into considering. He had carried it for longer than he admitted even to himself, through years of telling himself the carrying meant nothing in particular. As his carriage rolled to a stop outside the church, the sound of an organ still drifting faintly through the closed doors, Tristan Holloway sat for one long moment with his hand pressed flat against his coat, over the letter, over the ring, over 12 years of a story he had never told anyone in full. And then he stepped down into the cold morning air and walked toward the doors, as though the last 12 years had simply not happened at all. 12 years before that morning, in the weeks after everything between them had gone silent, Briallen had written a letter she never sent. Sitting at a small wooden table in a borrowed room, with her hands shaking badly enough that the first 2 attempts had to be discarded entirely, the ink smeared by her own trembling into something illegible even to her. She had wanted, more than she had wanted almost anything else in her life up to that point, to explain herself. Not to win him back, she told herself, but simply so that whatever he believed about her leaving would at least be true, rather than whatever convenient cruelty his family had no doubt offered him instead. The letter, when she finally finished it near dawn, said almost nothing of what she had intended. It did not explain the circumstances of her departure, nor the pressure that had been placed on her by people with far more power than a girl of her station could resist, nor the threats that had been made quietly in rooms she was never meant to know about, against the only family she had left in the world. Instead, it said simply that she was sorry, that she had not stopped caring, and that she hoped someday he would understand that some choices are made by people who have run out of other choices to make. She folded it twice, sealed it with wax she could not afford to waste, and then sat with it in her lap for the better part of an hour before finally placing it in the bottom of her trunk instead of the post. She told herself, in the years that followed, that she had made the wise decision, that sending it would have accomplished nothing beyond reopening a wound that needed, for both their sakes, to be allowed to close. But she had kept the letter anyway, carrying it from town to town in the false bottom of that same trunk, through every modest room she had ever rented, through every year she told herself she had stopped thinking about him, right up until the night before her wedding to Cassian Worth, when she had taken it out one final time, read it by candlelight, and finally, at long last, burned it in the small fireplace of her room, believing, wrongly, as it would turn out, that she was burning the last evidence that any of it had ever happened at all. The oak tree stood at the edge of a property that had, at the time, belonged to no one in particular as far as either of them were concerned, a forgotten boundary line between Tristan's family estate and the modest farms that bordered it, where a young man not yet burdened by his father's title and a young woman not yet burdened by her family's debts had first begun meeting in the early evenings, drawn together by the particular gravity that exists between 2 people who have decided, without quite admitting it aloud, that they would rather be in each other's company than almost anywhere else on earth. Their courtship, if it could even be called that in the formal sense neither of them had access to, was built entirely out of stolen hours and small, ordinary kindnesses. He taught her to identify the constellations using nothing more than patience and a clear sky. She taught him, in turn, how to mend a torn coat seam well enough that his valet never noticed the difference, a skill he found absurdly more useful than anything his formal education had ever offered him. They spoke, in those evenings beneath the oak tree, about futures that neither of their families would have permitted, futures where a title meant nothing, and a name meant even less, and for a handful of seasons, lying about the impossibility of it all felt easier than confronting what either of their families would actually do if they discovered the truth. It was beneath that same oak tree, on an evening in late autumn when the leaves had only just begun to turn, that Tristan had pressed his grandmother's ring into her palm for the first time. Not as a formal proposal, which neither of them was yet in any position to make, but as a private promise between two people who fully intended to find a way through every obstacle still standing between them. Briallen had held the ring for the length of one held breath, felt the full weight of what accepting it would mean for both of them, and then, gently, pressed it back into his hand, telling him to keep it safe until the day they could make the promise properly, a day she had genuinely believed, in that single golden moment, was still coming for them both. The winter that followed brought with it a sickness that moved through Briallen's small household with a speed that left no room for careful planning, taking her father within a fortnight and leaving behind debts that the family had concealed from her for years out of a kind of misplaced protective pride. Within that same brutal season, a man Briallen had never met before arrived at her family's door on behalf of interests she did not fully understand at the time, carrying with him both the outstanding debts and an offer to settle them entirely on the single condition that she leave the county immediately and sever, completely and without explanation, any connection to the Holloway family name. She had not known, in those first frightening days, that the offer had originated not from any creditor acting on his own interests, but from someone within Tristan's own family who had decided, with the particular ruthlessness of people protecting a bloodline, that a penniless girl with no title and no prospects represented a danger to the family's future that needed to be permanently and quietly removed. She learned only enough, a name overheard through a half-closed door, a signature on a document she was made to sign without being allowed to read it fully, to understand that refusing the arrangement would mean watching her mother and younger siblings lose the only roof still standing over their heads. She left in the dead of winter without a single word of explanation to the only person who deserved one, carrying nothing but a small trunk, a debt now quietly settled by people she would never meet face to face, and a silence she told herself she was choosing freely, though in truth it had been chosen for her by people with far more power than a grieving young woman could ever hope to resist. She told herself, walking away from that county in the bitter early morning cold, that someday the silence would stop hurting as much as it did in that exact moment, a belief that would take her the better part of 12 years to discover was only partially true. Cassian Worth was, by every honest measure, a good man, and Briallen had never once doubted this in the 2 years of their careful, unhurried courtship. He had inherited his father's tailoring business along with his father's quiet temperament, and he had built, through steady years of unglamorous effort, a small but respectable life that he was genuinely proud to offer her, never once pressing her for more affection than she seemed willing to give, never once asking the questions that a more demanding man might have insisted upon. He did not know, because she had never told him, and he had never thought to ask in the particular way that might have uncovered it, that the woman he was preparing to marry had spent a season of her youth beneath a different name, in a different county, learning the names of constellations from a young man who had not yet inherited the title that would eventually separate them entirely. He knew her only as Briallen Marsh, capable seamstress, quiet neighbor, a woman whose past seemed unremarkable enough that inquiring further had simply never occurred to him as necessary. He had proposed to her on an ordinary Tuesday afternoon in the small front room of his shop, with none of the drama that such moments are so often imagined to require, and she had said yes with what he believed, reasonably enough, to be genuine and uncomplicated affection. He had no way of knowing, as he stood at that altar 3 days later watching the church doors fly open with a force that made his hands go suddenly cold, that the carriage now stopping outside belonged to a chapter of his bride's life he had never even known existed. The sound that moved through the church in the seconds after the Duke crossed the threshold was not a single gasp, but a slow accumulation of them, rippling backward from the front pews to the rear in a wave that seemed to take the entire congregation several seconds to fully register, as though their bodies had understood the gravity of the moment before their minds had caught up to explain why. Someone's prayer book slipped from gloved hands and struck the stone floor with a sound that seemed, in that suspended silence, almost violently loud. Briallen had not yet turned, but she had recognized the particular cadence of those footsteps the instant they touched the church floor. A recognition that arrived in her body before her conscious mind had finished denying the possibility. The way one recognizes a voice calling from another room long before any words have actually been spoken. Her hand, still resting in Cassian's, went cold and still, and for one long, suspended moment, she simply could not make herself turn around, caught between 12 years of careful forgetting and the absolute certainty that forgetting had just run entirely out of road. Cassian felt her hand change beneath his own, felt the sudden absence of warmth where warmth had been a moment before, and turned first, following the direction of every other eye in the building toward the man now standing at the head of the aisle, hat still on, expression unreadable, looking at Briallen with an intensity that made it instantly, brutally clear to everyone present that whatever was happening here had nothing whatsoever to do with the wedding they had all gathered to witness. Mrs. Etta Linnett, seated in the second pew with the particular pride of a woman watching a girl she had practically raised find a measure of stability at last, felt her own breath catch the moment she saw the crest on the carriage through the church's narrow side window, a crest she had only ever seen once before, 12 years earlier, on the morning a different carriage had arrived to quietly, ruthlessly rearrange the entire course of Briallen's young life. Her hand rose to cover her mouth, before she had consciously decided to move it at all. She understood, in the space of that single frozen heartbeat, more than almost anyone else in that church was capable of understanding, because she alone had been present for fragments of the original story, gathered slowly over years from half-finished sentences and the particular silences that follow questions a person has decided never to fully answer. She had never told Briallen what she had known for years about the true source of her family's mysteriously settled debts. Known, not merely suspected, ever since a frightened young clerk named Hollis Price had appeared at her door one winter night 7 years ago and placed a folded document into her hands, saying only that he could no longer carry the weight of that particular silence alone. She had kept his secret as carefully as she kept Briallen's, partly out of respect for whatever locked door Briallen had chosen to keep closed, and partly, if she was honest with herself, out of a quiet fear of what reopening that door might eventually cost them both. What frightened her most, watching the Duke walk the length of that aisle with an expression she could not read, but instinctively distrusted, was not the disruption of the wedding itself, but the sudden, sickening possibility that the very people who had once paid to make Briallen disappear from this man's life might not be finished with her yet. A fear that would prove, within the hour, to be far more justified than even Mrs. Linnet, in her most anxious imaginings, could have fully prepared herself for. Right now, only one person in that church understands what is actually happening, and she is too afraid to say it out loud yet. The document she has kept hidden for 12 years is about to change everything you think you know about why Briallen really left. Stay with me, because the truth is closer than it has ever been. Lady Genevieve Strathorn sat 3 pews back on the groom's side, having arrived in the village under the pretense of visiting a distant acquaintance. A story thin enough that she had not particularly bothered to make it convincing, since she had not expected anyone in this small, unremarkable congregation to question the presence of a well-dressed stranger at the back of their church. She had positioned herself there deliberately, close enough to observe everything, far enough to remain unremarkable, and as the Duke's carriage came to a halt outside, the smile that crossed her face was not one of surprise, but of grim, satisfied recognition. The particular expression of someone watching a plan unfold exactly as she had quietly, carefully arranged for it to unfold. It was Lady Genevieve, cousin to the Duke and heir presumptive to a considerable portion of the Holloway fortune should Tristan continue, as he had for years, to refuse every marriage proposed to him, who had been responsible 12 years earlier for the quiet arrangement that removed Briallen from the county entirely. She had acted then out of a calculation as cold as it was simple. A duke entangled with a penniless girl of no family connection represented a direct threat to her own position within the family's future, and she had resolved the threat the way she resolved most inconvenient problems in her life, with money, with pressure, and with a complete absence of any consideration for the people whose lives she was quietly rearranging. What she had not anticipated, 12 years later, was that the letter currently pressed against Tristan's chest had been sent not by Briallen herself, who had spent over a decade believing the matter fully and permanently buried, but by Hollis Price, the same former clerk who had long ago handed Mrs. Linnet the proof of what he had helped arrange, a man who had spent years watching his own conscience grow heavier until he finally decided that the truth had remained hidden long enough, and that Tristan deserved to hear it directly, in his own words, before it was too late for any of them. Lady Genevieve had come to this wedding not to witness a reunion, but to manage what she still believed was a containable situation, entirely unaware that the version of events she had spent 12 years controlling was now, in this very church, about to slip permanently and irreversibly beyond her reach. Tristan stopped some 6 feet from the altar, close enough now that Briallen had finally, slowly, turned to face him. Her expression caught somewhere between disbelief and a grief so old it had calcified into something resembling calm. The church had gone fully silent by now, the priest still holding his place in the open book with no idea whatsoever how to proceed. And into that silence, Tristan spoke 4 words that meant nothing at all to anyone present except the one woman they were intended for. You kept the date. Briallen's composure, which had survived 12 years of careful rebuilding, very nearly broke entirely at those words, because she understood instantly what almost no one else in that church possibly could, that the date of her wedding to Cassian Worth, chosen for no reason she had ever consciously examined, fell on the same day, 12 years later, as the evening beneath the oak tree when he had first placed his grandmother's ring into her palm. She had told herself for months that the date meant nothing, a simple availability in the church calendar and nothing more. And standing now before him, she understood with a kind of quiet horror that some part of her had clearly never believed that explanation for a single moment. Cassian, watching this exchange with an expression that had moved rapidly past confusion into something far more wounded, asked the only question he could manage in that moment, his voice low and unsteady. "Briallen, who is this man to you?" and it was Mrs. Linnet, rising unsteadily from the second pew with her hand still pressed to her chest, who answered before Briallen could find any words of her own, her voice carrying clearly through the silent church. He is the reason she left 12 years ago, and I believe, God forgive me, that I know exactly who made her go. Tristan reached into his coat at this, and the small square of velvet he withdrew seemed, to everyone watching, entirely too modest an object to account for the weight the moment had suddenly acquired until he unwrapped it with hands that were noticeably less steady than the composed expression on his face suggested, revealing a ring whose gold had dulled slightly with age, but whose central stone still caught the church's pale light with an unmistakable, quiet brilliance. "This belonged to my grandmother," he said, addressing the words to Briallen alone, though every other person in that church heard them as clearly as she did. "I have carried it for 12 years because I could not make myself give it to anyone else, and because some part of me refused to fully believe that you had chosen to leave me of your own will, no matter how completely the silence afterward seemed to confirm it." He paused, his composure cracking for the first time since he had entered the building. "I received a letter 3 days ago that told me I was right not to believe it." Briallen's eyes moved from the ring to his face, and then, finally, to Mrs. Linnet, who was already nodding before the question had even fully formed on Briallen's lips, confirming what Briallen herself had begun in the last several minutes. To suspect with a dawning and entirely unwelcome clarity that her departure 12 years earlier had not been the private tragedy of two heartbroken young people quietly outgrowing each other, but the deliberate, calculated result of someone's interference. Someone in that very church who had spent over a decade believing the matter permanently closed. "Miss Two." Linnet reached into the small bag she carried, the same worn leather bag she had carried to church every single Sunday for as long as anyone in the village could remember, and withdrew from its inner lining a folded piece of paper gone soft and yellowed with age, a document she had kept hidden for 12 years out of a promise she had made to a frightened, grieving young woman who had begged her, on the night before fleeing the county, never to show it to anyone as long as she lived. Your father did not simply die owing debts that someone generously chose to settle, Mrs. Linnet said quietly, unfolding the paper with hands that trembled slightly despite her evident determination to finish what she had started. "He died owing nothing at all. A clerk who once worked for the Holloway family brought me this document years ago, unable to carry the weight of what he had helped arrange. I kept his secret and yours both, and I have regretted every single day since that I did not have the courage to act on it while there was still time to undo any of what was done." She extended the document toward Briallen, who took it with fingers that had gone entirely numb. The paper, when Briallen finally managed to read it through eyes blurred with 12 years of unshed grief, revealed a transaction dated to the exact week of her departure, authorizing a payment to settle debts that, according to the very same document, had never actually existed in the amount claimed, a payment made not by any creditor, but by a name Briallen recognized instantly, a name belonging to the very family she had spent over a decade believing had simply, quietly forgotten she ever existed at all. The name on the document was not Lady Genevieve's own, listed instead under the name of an intermediary she had employed specifically to keep her own involvement at a careful, deniable distance. But Mrs. Linnet, watching the color drain entirely from Lady Genevieve's face from across the church, did not need a signature to know with absolute certainty who had truly been behind the arrangement. "She knows," Mrs. Linnet said simply, turning to face the woman 3 pews back. "Look at her face. She has known this entire time." Lady Genevieve rose from her seat with the brittle composure of someone attempting, too late, to manage a situation that had already moved decisively beyond her control. her voice climbing toward a kind of defensive sharpness that fooled no one in that church any longer. I did what was necessary to protect this family's future from an entirely unsuitable attachment, she said, the words sounding, even to her own ears, considerably weaker, spoken aloud in a church full of witnesses than they had ever sounded in the private comfort of her own justifications. I do not regret it. The girl had nothing to offer this family beyond complication. Tristan turned to face his cousin fully for the first time since entering the building, and the look on his face, calm on its surface but unmistakably dangerous beneath it, was enough to make Lady Genevieve take an involuntary step backward toward the church door. 12 years, he said quietly, each word landing with the precise, deliberate weight of a man who had finally, completely run out of patience for people who mistook his composure for permission. You took 12 years from us, Genevieve, and you call it protecting the family. I think it is time the entire family, and indeed this entire kingdom, learned exactly what you actually protected and exactly what it cost. The woman responsible for everything has just been named, in front of the entire congregation. But naming her is not the same as undoing 12 years of damage. What happens in the next few minutes will decide whether Briallen walks away from this church with the truth alone, or with something far more important. Don't look away now. This is the part the whole kingdom will still be talking about tomorrow. It was Briallen herself who finally broke the silence that followed Tristan's words, stepping back from Cassian with a gentleness that acknowledged, even in this extraordinary moment, the genuine kindness he had shown her over 2 patient years, before turning to face the full congregation for the first time since the church doors had opened. My name was not always Briallen Marsh, she said, her voice steadier than she had any right to expect it to be, given the 12 years of carefully maintained silence she was about to undo in front of nearly everyone she had come to know. I was born Briallen Vasworth, daughter of a man whose debts, it now seems, were invented entirely to give someone a reason to remove me from a life I had never been considered worthy enough to keep. The name landed differently across the congregation, depending on who was hearing it. To most of the villagers, it meant nothing at all, simply a stranger's surname attached to a woman they thought they had known completely. But to a handful of older guests on the groom's side, distant relations of the Holloway family who had been invited only as a courtesy to Cassian's connections in town, the name registered with a visible jolt of recognition, fragments of an old, half-forgotten scandal suddenly reassembling itself into a far more coherent shape than any of them had previously bothered to piece together. I left because I believed I had no choice left to make, Briallen continued, her eyes moving once, briefly to Tristan, before returning to the congregation at large. I did not leave because I stopped caring. I have spent 12 years building a life out of the belief that the choice, however it was made, was at least mine to carry the consequences of alone. I am only now learning that it was never entirely my choice at all, and I find I do not yet know what to do with the anger that realization has put directly into my chest, in front of all of you, on what was meant to be my wedding day. Cassian had stood through the entire revelation with the particular stillness of a man absorbing far more than he had ever expected a single morning to demand of him, his expression moving through confusion, hurt, and finally something closer to a weary, dignified clarity. The look of someone recognizing that the life he had carefully built his proposal around had simply never been the whole picture he believed it to be. When he finally spoke, his voice carried none of the anger the moment might reasonably have justified, only a quiet, direct need to understand exactly where he himself now stood. "Do you love him?" Cassian asked, addressing the question to Briallen alone, ignoring entirely the Duke standing some 6 feet away, his attention fixed only on the woman he had genuinely, carefully come to love over 2 unhurried years. Not 12 years ago. Now. Today. I have built a life I was proud to offer you, and I find I would still rather know the honest answer than spend even one more day inside a comfortable, convenient silence of my own." Briallen did not answer immediately, and the silence that followed was, in its own way, more revealing than any words could have been, stretching long enough that several people in the church found themselves holding their breath without quite realizing they had started. "I don't yet know what I feel today," she finally said, turning to look at Cassian with an honesty she clearly understood he deserved above almost anyone else in that building. "I know what I felt 12 years ago, and I know it never fully left, no matter how completely I told myself it had. I am sorry, Cassian. You deserved a wedding day that was actually about you, and I am so sorry that this one was never going to be that." Tristan stepped forward then, closing the remaining distance between himself and Briallen with a deliberateness that silenced whatever murmuring had begun to ripple through the watching congregation. And when he finally stopped before her, he did something that no one in that church, least of all Briallen herself, had any reason to expect from a man of his title and his famously guarded composure. He lowered himself onto one knee on the cold stone floor, directly in front of the altar where she had stood only minutes earlier prepared to marry someone else entirely. "I am not here to claim you the way a man claims property, though I understand entirely why it might have looked that way the moment I walked through those doors," he said, holding the ring up between them with a hand that was no longer even attempting to hide its trembling. "I am here because I received a letter 3 days ago that told me the truth I should have fought far harder to learn 12 years ago, and because I have spent every single one of those 12 years carrying a ring I could never make myself give to anyone else, for reasons I think both of us have always understood perfectly well, even when neither of us would say them aloud. I am not asking you to forgive 12 years in a single morning," he continued, his voice dropping lower, meant now almost entirely for her alone, though every word still carried clearly through the silent church. "I am asking only for the chance to finish a promise that was made beneath an oak tree before either of us understood how much the world outside that tree was prepared to cost us for daring to make it. Briallen Vassworth, will you let me try?" The story did not stay contained within the walls of that small village church for longer than it took the first guests to reach their own homes and begin repeating it to anyone who would listen. And by the time evening settled over the county, the tale had already begun traveling along the particular invisible roads that scandal and wonder travel best, carried by servants to their employers, by tradesmen to their customers, by anyone who had either witnessed the morning's events firsthand or simply knew someone who had. By the following week, the story had reached the capital itself, growing slightly more dramatic with each retelling, but losing none of its essential, astonishing truth. That the Duke of Holloway had interrupted a commoner's wedding to reclaim a woman his own cousin had spent 12 years and a small fortune trying to erase from his life entirely, and that the woman in question had turned out to be no mere commoner at all, but the long-lost daughter of a family whose name, once cleared of the debts that had never actually existed, carried more honor than the scandal had ever managed to bury. Lady Genevieve Strathorn's role in the affair, once exposed in that church before dozens of witnesses who had no particular reason to protect her, proved impossible to contain or quietly smooth over, and within a fortnight she had been formally and permanently removed from any claim on the Holloway family's fortune. Her name becoming, almost overnight, a quiet, cautionary tale, repeated in drawing rooms across the kingdom about exactly how far ambition can travel before it finally runs out of road to stand on. The second wedding, when it finally took place some months later, bore almost no resemblance to the one that had been so dramatically interrupted, held not in the small village church, but in the gardens of the Holloway estate itself, beneath an oak tree that Tristan had insisted, against the quiet protests of his household staff, remain entirely unpruned and untamed for the occasion, exactly as it had looked 12 years earlier when he had first pressed a ring into the palm of a girl with no title and no fortune to her name. Cassian Worth attended, seated near the front by Briallen's own personal invitation, having found in the months since that first interrupted morning a strange and unexpected peace with everything that had happened, eventually courting and marrying a woman from a neighboring town who, as he liked to say afterward with a quiet, genuine smile, had never once made him feel as though he were standing in anyone else's shadow. It was Mrs. Etta Linnet who walked Briallen down the aisle on that second, finally uninterrupted wedding day, her hand steady on Briallen's arm. The document that had once been folded in secrecy for 12 years, now framed and hanging, by Briallen's own request, in a quiet hallway of the Holloway estate, as a permanent reminder of exactly what silence can cost, and exactly what the truth, however long delayed, is still capable of repairing. Because in the end, the kingdom did not remember Briallen as the woman a duke had claimed at her own wedding. They remembered her as the woman who had waited 12 years for a truth that was never hers to chase alone, and who found, when it finally arrived, that some promises survive every silence built to bury them. If this story moved you, do 3 simple things before you go. Subscribe so you don't miss the next one, like this video so more people can find it, and share it with someone who still believes that the truth, no matter how long it takes, is always worth waiting for. Thank you for staying until the very end, and I'll see you in the next story.